Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today, as always, is to take this stack of sources, the ones you've shared with us, and really dig in to uncover the essential insights.
Exactly. We're trying to pull out those key nuggets of knowledge, find the signal in the noise so you can get up to speed on important topics quickly.
Precisely. And today we're plunging into excerpts from a really fascinating ancient text, often called the Wisdom of Solomon. You've given us this material, and we're going to walk through it together.
Yeah, we'll try to extract the most important points about its key ideas, its historical context, and its lasting impact.
It's a book that sits maybe just outside the core Hebrew Bible canon for many traditions, but it sounds incredibly significant.
Oh, it is. It gives us a unique window, really, into how Jewish thought was developing, especially in a Hellenistic environment, grappling with big philosophical questions.
And it might have influenced later writings, too.
Potentially, yes. Quite significantly, according to some scholars, as we'll see.
Okay, so let's unpack this material. We've got wisdom, justice, history, and this deep contrast drawn between different ways of living. Sounds like a lot to cover.
It's definitely a text that rewards a deeper look. Let's dive in.
All right, let's start right at the beginning of our source material then. The concept of wisdom itself, chokmah in Hebrew. It seems it wasn't always just about, purely religious or philosophical stuff.
That's a really crucial starting point. The sources you shared make it clear that the term chokmah and the chokamim, the wise men, didn't originally just mean deep thinkers. Initially, it was much broader.
Broader how?
It meant skill. Skill in doing pretty much anything. It was about expertise, practical ability, competence.
So not just knowing things in your head, but actually being good at making or doing things.
Exactly. Practical skill. The sources give some great examples, actually very tangible ones. Think of the skill of artisans or goldsmiths working with metal, or sailors navigating the sea. Even the very specific cultivated skill of professional mourning women performing lamentations. Or even the technical know-how of astrologers and magicians. It covered a really wide range of expertise.
That's a much wider net than how we typically use the word wisdom today, isn't it? So how does it morph into the more, let's say, spiritual or theological idea we find in the wisdom literature?
Well, the term definitely evolved. It sort of moved upwards in abstraction, you could say. First, it started applying to skill in administration, managing affairs, the kind of wisdom you need to govern effectively, handle people, resources.
Right, like political or managerial wisdom.
Yes. And then it became more specifically tied to being far-seeing in religious things. That's the phrase the sources use.
Ah, okay. So skill in running things shifts towards insight into spiritual matters.
Pretty much. The sources point to passages in books like Hosea, Deuteronomy, Isaiah to show this shift towards a more defined religious discernment. So while the word could mean all those practical skills, by the time we get to the core wisdom literature, like the Book of Wisdom we're focusing on, wisdom gets technically applied to saying, doing, and thinking things specifically concerned with religion. That becomes the primary focus within these texts.
Got it. So even if the word had broader origins in this literature, the ultimate content, the core meaning of wisdom, is always religious.
Absolutely. And the sources really pinpoint the heart of this religious wisdom. It's the ability to truly distinguish between good and evil. That capacity, that discernment is seen as what enables humans to stand in a proper, close relationship with God.
And okay, if that core ability, distinguishing good from evil, comes from God,
then the logic follows that every form of wisdom, even those seemingly mundane practical skills, the artisan's craft, the administrator's insight we talked about, ultimately flows from God too.
Ah, I see.
The sources emphasize this. While, yes, the knowledge and fear of the Lord are the highest expression of this wisdom, the less exalted forms are still seen as part of that one single divine gift.
That really clarifies the connection. So worldly wisdom being a good builder, say, or a clever negotiator, it isn't fundamentally different in kind from divine wisdom.
It's different in degree or maybe application. But the origin, according to this view, is the same. It all comes from God.
Right.
And the sources link this understanding directly to books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Those texts spend a lot of time on worldly wisdom, giving moral precepts, practical advice for getting by.
Sure. Lots of practical tips in Proverbs.
Exactly. But the underlying principle, which the Book of Wisdom really elaborates on, is that both the practical side and the divine side of wisdom come from the same ultimate source, God.
Now, here's something really intriguing the sources bring up, some external context. They mention that this idea, wisdom being tied to creation and the divine, wasn't totally unique to the Hebrew tradition. There were parallels elsewhere.
That's right. Specifically in ancient Babylonian teaching, it's quite fascinating. According to accounts mentioned in the sources, the Babylonians also conceived of wisdom dwelling somewhere.
Where?
In the primordial depths of the sea, alongside Ea, who was a major creative deity in their pantheon.
Wow, in the deep sea.
Yeah. Apsu, which just means the deep, was apparently called the House of Wisdom, and Ea himself had the title, the Lord of Wisdom.
So this imagery, wisdom linked to the cosmic deep, to creation, to a primary god, that echoes a bit, doesn't it, with how wisdom is sometimes described in these Jewish texts?
It does resonate. The sources note this parallel as, well, interesting. It suggests a potential shared cultural background, maybe, or at least common ways of symbolizing these deep ideas about creation and divine knowledge in the ancient Near East. It gives us a broader context.
Okay, that gives us a really solid foundation for the concept itself. But the sources make another crucial point, which is that the idea of wisdom within the wisdom literature itself wasn't static. It changed. It developed.
Yes, it went through stages of growth. And understanding this progression is really key to grasping how these religious ideas evolved within the tradition itself.
So it wasn't just one fixed definition.
Not at all. When you look at these texts chronologically, or at least group them by likely period, you can trace a clear development in how wisdom is portrayed.
Okay, let's walk through these stages as the sources lay them out. What's first?
Right. Stage 1, abstract wisdom.
Yeah.
The sources say that in the earliest parts of the wisdom literature, proper think Proverbs, from about chapter 10 onwards, wisdom is consistently presented as purely abstract.
Meaning
It's a quality, a set of principles for living well, a characteristic of God, maybe, or of the wise person, but it's not described as like a separate being or entity, just an idea, a characteristic.
Okay, abstract. Got it. What's the next step then?
Stage 2, personified wisdom. This is where things get really interesting. It's a major development, and you find it in later sections of Proverbs, specifically chapters 1 to 9, which the sources date around the 3rd century BC, and then, very dramatically, in the Book of Wisdom itself, wisdom becomes personified.
Personified. So talked about as if she's an actual person,
Yeah.
with her own thoughts, attributes, actions.
Exactly that. The sources point to specific passages. Proverbs 8, verses 22 to 31 is a famous one, where wisdom herself speaks, recounting how she existed alongside God before creation. She describes herself almost like a master workman involved in the whole creative process.
Wow.
And then in the Book of Wisdom, chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, the writer addresses God, saying, "Who madest all things by thy word, and by thy wisdom didst form man." She's right there with God at creation. And later in Wisdom, chapter 18, verse 15, she, or the word, they're closely linked, is even depicted as the agent carrying out the plague on the Egyptian firstborn.
So she goes from being just a quality of God to being almost like a companion or a co-worker with God.
Pretty much, yeah. A distinct figure, though still inherently divine. This personification is a really significant step, and the sources stress it's highly important for understanding later theological developments.
Okay, what's stage 3?
Stage 3, identification with the law. This becomes especially prominent in the book of Ecclesiastes, which is also known as the Wisdom of Ben Sira.
Ben Sira. How does he connect wisdom and the law, the Torah?
Well, Ben Sira essentially teaches that the practical path to living a wise life, a life that reflects divine wisdom, is through obedience to God's commandments, the law given to Israel through Moses.
So following the rules is being wise.
In essence, yes. Human wisdom, our moral understanding and right conduct, finds its truest expression and gets closest to God's wisdom by adhering to the law. That worldly, practical wisdom we talked about, managing affairs, making good choices, it becomes aligned with the divine precepts found in the law. The sources note this identification happens almost of necessity in Ben Sira's thought.
Are there specific examples?
Oh, yes. The sources highlight Ecclesiastes 15, verse 1. He that feareth the Lord doeth this, seeks wisdom, and he that taketh hold of the law findeth her wisdom. It's quite direct.
Finding wisdom by grasping the law.
Exactly. And even more explicitly in chapter 24, verses 23 to 25, Ben Sira writes, after a long praise of wisdom, all these things concerning wisdom are the book of the covenant of God Most High, the law which Moses commanded.
Wow, that's about as clear an equation as you can get. Wisdom is the law, or at least fully contained within it.
For Ben Sira, yes, that seems to be the core idea. Okay, then we see further development, especially when we get back to the book of wisdom itself, with stage 4, identification with the Holy Spirit.
Wisdom and the Holy Spirit. How does the book link those two?
The sources point to passages like Wisdom chapter 1, verses 4 to 7, and especially chapter 9, verse 17. Here, the writer, speaking as Solomon, prays to God. And who can know thy counsel, except thou give him wisdom and send thy Holy Spirit from on high?
So wisdom is presented as a divine gift again, but now closely connected with, maybe even delivered by, the Holy Spirit.
That seems to be the implication. It suggests maybe not just following external commands, but receiving an internal divine presence or power that is wisdom or brings wisdom.
Interesting. And there's one more stage mentioned?
Yes, stage 5, identification with the word of the Lord. This is also found prominently in the Book of Wisdom.
We touched on that verse earlier, Wisdom 9, verses 1 and 2. O God of the fathers, who madest all things by thy word, and by thy wisdom didst form man.
Exactly. The sources are careful to note here that while the term word, logos in Greek, is used, it's probably understood in the Jewish sense, more like God's active utterance or command, not yet the fully developed Christian logos doctrine you see in the Gospel of John.
But still significant.
Oh, definitely. The sources say it contains the germ of that later conception. The idea of a divine agent, the Word, actively involved in creation, working alongside wisdom.
So this whole progression, from abstract quality to personified agent, then identified with the law of the Spirit and the Word. That's quite a journey for one concept.
It really is. And as the sources summarize, it wasn't perfectly neat or linear across all the texts. Proverbs shows that move from abstract to personified. Job has bits of personification alongside wisdom gained from experience. Ecclesiastes, interestingly, stays abstract but views wisdom through a unique pessimistic lens. Ecclesiastes makes that strong equation between wisdom and the law. And then the Book of Wisdom takes the personification further, linking her to the Spirit and the Word, and really emphasizing her divine origin and preexistence before creation.
And the sources say this whole development is of high importance for the study of Christian doctrine. Why is that?
Well, seeing this historical trajectory within Jewish thought helps us understand the intellectual and theological background, the sort of conceptual soil from which later Christian ideas could emerge, particularly ideas about the nature of Christ as the divine logos, the Word, and the distinct role of the Holy Spirit.
It shows it wasn't created in a vacuum.
Exactly. It shows a dynamic theological tradition actively exploring God's relationship with the world, using these evolving concepts like wisdom to articulate how God acts and relates to creation and humanity.
Okay, that's the evolution of the idea of wisdom. But the sources also mention a change in the outward form, the literary style.
Yes, that's another interesting point. If you compare the different books in this wisdom tradition, you notice a shift in how the ideas are presented. Something that might be a short, sharp proverb in the earlier parts of Proverbs can get expanded in later books into what may almost be called a miniature essay.
A miniature essay, so taking one idea and really unpacking it, elaborating on it.
Exactly. The sources say it's not like every saying becomes an essay, but it happens often enough, especially if you compare Ecclesiastes in the Book of Wisdom with Proverbs, that you can see a distinct development in literary style. The writers aren't just delivering wisdom in bite-sized nuggets anymore. They're building arguments, explaining, elaborating more.
So both the concept of wisdom and the way it's written about evolve over time. That's fascinating. Okay, let's zoom in now specifically on the Book of Wisdom, since that's the core text in these excerpts. The sources give us some key insights into where it might have come from and why it was written.
They do. First, regarding its basic origins. The sources are clear. The book was originally written in Greek. That's the scholarly consensus based on the language itself.
And the title. In the surviving Greek manuscripts, it's called The Wisdom of Solomon.
Correct. However, the sources immediately flag that even in very early times, people questioned whether Solomon actually wrote it. They mention the old Latin version, which just calls it the Book of Wisdom, suggesting some uncertainty about the author.
They dropped Solomon's name.
Right. And the Syriac version went even further. It explicitly states doubt about Solomonic authorship and suggests that maybe some other wise man wrote it, using Solomon's name as a kind of tribute or framework, but that the book was still accepted, even though it wasn't literally by him.
So even ancient readers were like, probably not Solomon writing this hundreds of years after he lived.
Exactly. And the sources explain this using the idea of a pseudepigraphic title, as it was understood back then. It wasn't necessarily like a modern forgery meant to deceive. It was more like a legitimate literary convention. A later writer, steeped in the tradition, could use the name of a revered figure like Solomon to lend authority to their work. They were presenting Solomonic wisdom teachings in the style and spirit of the ultimate wise king, even if they weren't Solomon himself.
That context is crucial. It's about connecting to a tradition and conveying authority, not a literal authorship claim in our modern sense.
Precisely. Now, probably one of the most compelling theories the sources present about the purpose of the Book of Wisdom is its potential relationship with another book, Ecclesiastes.
Ah, okay. What's the connection there?
Well, there's a theory attributed by the sources to Jean Plumtree and called highly probable that a major reason the Book of Wisdom was written was specifically to combat the teachings found in Ecclesiastes.
Combat Ecclesiastes. But isn't Ecclesiastes also considered wisdom literature? Why argue against it?
Good question. The sources explain that Ecclesiastes wasn't universally embraced without some controversy back then. Some groups, like certain stricter Pharisees, apparently viewed it with suspicion. They felt it might be tainted by philosophical ideas they opposed, like Epicureanism or Sadduceeism.
Right, those philosophies are often associated with materialism, maybe skepticism about the afterlife, focusing on earthly enjoyment.
Exactly. So the sources suggest that if Ecclesiastes was being interpreted in that light, maybe seen as promoting a kind of lawless sensuality based on lines like, "Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die," and seeming to cast doubt on the soul's immortality, then a writer deeply concerned with divine justice, righteousness, and the afterlife would see it as problematic, even erroneous teaching.
So the author of Wisdom adopts the persona of Solomon to present a different kind of Solomon, one whose wisdom affirms God's order and justice, countering the pessimism and doubt potentially found in Ecclesiastes.
That's the idea. And another Solomon offering a corrective. The sources state quite explicitly that this perceived erroneous teaching of Ecclesiastes seems to have been constantly in the mind of the author of Wisdom, at least when writing the first main part of the book, chapters 1 to 9.
And is there textual evidence for this?
Yes, the sources mention comparisons made by scholars like Barton. They show how the descriptions of the worldview of the ungodly in Wisdom chapter 2, for example, don't just agree in substance with similar passages in Ecclesiastes, but often use strikingly similar language.
So the wisdom author is putting words that sound like Ecclesiastes into the mouths of the wicked people he's arguing against.
It seems that way. It strongly suggests that the whole attitude and outlook of the two books are fundamentally opposed, giving the Book of Wisdom a clear purpose to offer a rebuttal from a more traditional theistic perspective.
Okay, that makes sense as a motivation. But even within the Book of Wisdom, the sources talk about another debate. Was it written by one person, or is it a composite work?
That's right. Even scholars who lean towards a single author acknowledge there are marked differences between the two main sections of the book. There's part 1, chapters 1 to 9, which focuses more on the nature of wisdom, contrasting the righteous and the ungodly.
Right.
And then there's part 2, chapters 10 to 19, which is largely a retelling of Israelite history, particularly the Exodus story.
So what are the key differences that make scholars think it might be two different authors or written at different times?
The sources lay out 3 main arguments for composite authorship. First, style and language. Part 1 is described as being, relatively simple, direct, often using that Hebrew-style parallelism we see in the Psalms or Proverbs.
Okay.
But part 2, the style shifts dramatically. It's described as ambitious, grandiloquent, perhaps even turgid, more complex, artificial, often without that parallelism. It just feels like a different writer.
The whole tone and feel changes.
Yeah. Second, the role of wisdom herself. As we discussed, wisdom is absolutely central, often vividly personified in part 1. But in part 2, she almost disappears. She's barely mentioned. And when she is, like in chapter 14, verse 2, it's in a different sense.
That does seem odd. If wisdom is so important in the first half, why drop her in the second, especially when retelling history where she could have been shown acting?
Exactly. The sources find that puzzling for a single author who held such an exalted view of wisdom in the first part. And third, the conception of God's action. In part 1, God often seems to act indirectly, through wisdom. Remember Wisdom 7:22 to 8:1 or 8:6.
Right, wisdom as God's agent.
But in part 2, God's action is typically portrayed as direct intervention. God himself acts, like in 15:1 or 15:1. The intermediary role of wisdom seems diminished or absent.
So God uses wisdom in part 1, but acts more personally in part 2.
That's the distinction the sources point out. Now, there are attempts to explain this under a single author theory, like Eichhorn suggesting maybe the author wrote part 1 in youth and part 2 in maturity, or Goodrick proposing the author adapted the work later to address a specific persecution, adding the historical section. But the writer of the source material seems to find it difficult to believe these very differing parts came from the same hand.
It sounds like the argument for multiple authors, or at least different stages of writing, is pretty strong then.
The sources definitely seem to lean that way. Now, trying to figure out when the book was written is also really complex. The sources walk us through various pieces of evidence, but pinning down a date is tricky.
What kind of evidence do they look at?
Well, one thing is how the book uses Greek translations of the Old Testament. It quotes from the Septuagint, that's the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, that was widely used by Greek-speaking Jews. Specifically, it quotes from the Greek versions of Isaiah and Job. Now, we have some external evidence for dating the Septuagint translations. The Greek translation of the prophets seems to have existed before 132 BC, because the prologue to Ecclesiastes mentions it.
Okay.
But Job is part of the Hagiographa, the writings, which were generally translated into Greek later, though likely before the mid-1st century AD because, as we'll discuss, St. Paul seems to have known the book.
So quoting Isaiah might suggest an earlier date, maybe mid-2nd century BC at the earliest. But quoting Job might push it later, maybe closer to the start of the Christian era.
That's the kind of reasoning involved, yeah. But the sources caution that these points alone aren't absolutely conclusive. It's circumstantial.
What else? Are there attempts to link it to specific historical events?
Yes. A scholar named Goodrick made a strong argument, mentioned in the sources, linking certain passages like Wisdom 2, 10:20, 6, 599, 14, 16-20, to the conditions faced by Jews under the Roman Emperor Caligula, around AD 37 to 41.
Caligula, what in the book matches that specific period?
Goodrick points to several things. Descriptions of Jews suffering intense persecution, hints of enforced idolatry, possibly including the worship of a living man. Caligula famously demanded this. This persecution being carried out partly by apostate Jews, maybe those influenced by philosophies like Epicureanism, perhaps using Ecclesiastes to justify themselves, and the persecution happening within a hostile populace like in Alexandria, known for Egyptian superstitions and Greek anti-Jewish sentiment. He felt the book's severe, judgmental tone fit a period of temporary relief after such intense suffering, maybe around AD 41 to 44.
That's incredibly specific, a very detailed argument connecting it to a particular few years.
It is. But the sources also provide counter-arguments. Other scholars, like Toy, argue the author could have described suffering vividly without necessarily living through that exact event. Emperor worship happened before Caligula too. And Grimm suggests the passage about the origins of idolatry, 1416-20, might just be a general learned account, not necessarily referring to contemporary kings.
So that specific Caligula connection isn't universally accepted. Okay. What about linking it to other writers, like Philo of Alexandria? He was a major Jewish philosopher there around the turn of the eras.
Right. Gregg's argument, noted in the sources, focuses on part 1, chapters 1-9. Philo was born around 20 BC. Gregg suggests part 1 might have been written before Philo, maybe around 50 BC.
Why before?
The reasoning is a bit subtle. It suggested that if Philo himself had originated some of the philosophical ideas found in Wisdom Part 1, like the descriptions of wisdom, he probably would have presented them more argumentatively, more polemically. The fact that they appear somewhat established in Wisdom suggests they might have been circulating before Philo wrote, giving him time to engage with them later. So maybe 50 BC for Part 1 allows time for these ideas to develop.
Interesting argument. And Part 2 is headed to date.
Yes, that's trickier. Overall, the sources seem to lean away from a very early date for the whole book, but they acknowledge the uncertainty. The tentative suggestion seems to be maybe Part 1 around 50 BC and Part 2 sometime before the mid-1st century AD.
And why that endpoint, mid-1st century AD?
Primarily because of the strong evidence that the Apostle Paul knew and was influenced by the Book of Wisdom. If Paul knew it, it had to exist and be circulating by the time he was writing his letters, mostly in the 50s AD.
Okay, that influence on St. Paul. The sources make a pretty strong case for that, don't they?
They really do. They argue there are a large number of parallels, not just in ideas but in specific language, between wisdom and Paul's epistles.
Now, some of those could just be common ideas floating around in Jewish thought at the time, right?
Absolutely. The sources acknowledge that. For instance, the idea that death entered the world through Adam's sin, you see that in Romans chapter 5 and Wisdom chapter 2. That basic idea is in Genesis.
Right.
But Wisdom adds a specific detail, that it was by the envy of the devil that death entered the world. Wisdom 2:23-24. That detail isn't in Genesis. The sources suggest this phrase might have become an established way of talking about it, which Paul could have picked up. Or the idea of the righteous eventually judging nations that appears in Wisdom 3:8 and 1 Corinthians 6:2. Again, could be a shared concept.
But the sources point to examples they consider much stronger evidence, where it's not just the idea, but the way it's developed that's similar.
Exactly. The striking instances of direct influence. A key example they give is the armor of God imagery. If you compare Wisdom chapter 5, verses 17-20, with Ephesians chapter 6, verses 11-20.
The famous passage in Ephesians about putting on the whole armor of God.
Right. Both passages clearly build on an earlier text in Isaiah chapter 59 where God himself puts on armor. But the sources argue that the similarity in how Wisdom and Ephesians elaborate on this metaphor, the specific pieces of armor listed, breastplate of righteousness, helmet of salvation, etc., and their symbolic meanings, is just too close to be accidental or independent development.
That does sound like more than coincidence.
It seems quite compelling. Another example given is the potter metaphor. Compare Wisdom chapter 15, verse 7, with Romans chapter 9, verses 21-23. Now, God as a potter shaping clay is a common image in the Old Testament, sure.
Yeah, Jeremiah uses it.
Right. But the sources emphasize the striking similarity in the use and development of that Old Testament metaphor and these specific passages in Wisdom and Romans, the way they both use it to talk about God's sovereignty, vessels for honor and dishonor. It suggests Paul was familiar with Wisdom's specific take on it.
So it's the detailed elaboration again.
That's the argument. The sources even quote a scholar, Thackeray, who concluded quite strongly that Paul made a close study of the Apocryphal book. Thackeray suggested that Wisdom's blend of Jewish tradition and Hellenistic thought coming out of Alexandria would have really appealed to Paul, who famously sought to be all things to all men, engaging different cultural contexts. He took what was good wherever it offered itself.
And this influence wasn't just superficial, like borrowing a phrase.
No, Thackeray argued it was both formal in style and argument and substantial, impacting Paul's views on key theological topics like idolatry, on predestination, and on eschatology. Views about the end times.
Wow. Okay, so for you, the listener interested in how religious ideas develop and spread, this is huge. Here we have this ancient book authorship debated, dating uncertain, grappling with big questions in a complex cultural melting pot like Alexandria, and it potentially plays a significant role in shaping the thinking of a foundational figure like St. Paul.
It really underscores the relevance of studying these texts, even those outside the main canonical scriptures for some traditions. They reveal the vibrant intellectual and theological conversations happening, especially in the Jewish diaspora, where traditional beliefs encountered Greek philosophy head-on.
It's a crucial piece of the puzzle for understanding that whole period. Okay, so we've got the background, the concept of wisdom, how it evolved, the context of the Book of Wisdom itself. Now let's really dive into the content of the book based on the excerpts. A huge theme, as you mentioned, is this stark contrast drawn between the righteous and the ungodly.
Yes, this contrast is central. It provides the dramatic framework and drives home the book's core message about divine justice and the ultimate consequences of how one chooses to live.
The sources clearly lay out the worldview of the ungodly, based on passages like chapter 1, verses 116, and chapter 2, verses 120. What's their take on life and death?
It's profoundly pessimistic, you could say, and materialistic. They basically see life as random, purely a matter of chance. It's short, brutish, and ends in nothing. Complete annihilation.
No afterlife, no soul.
None. The sources describe their reasoning. Life is fleeting, breath is just smoke, our reason is a mere spark from our heartbeat, the body decays to ashes, the spirit vanishes like thin air. After death, there's nothing left. Your name is forgotten, your works disappear. Death is the final, inescapable end for everyone. And their conclusion from this is bleak. Unrighteousness, basically living for yourself now, is the acquisition of death. Since death is the end anyway, might as well grab what you can.
And how does that bleak worldview affect how they treat others, especially those who live by different principles?
Well, according to chapter 2, verses 10-20, it leads them to actively oppress and mock the righteous. They can't stand the righteous person because his life is a reproach to their own. They sneer at him for following the law, for sticking to principles they see as pointless. They call his life madness and expect his end to be just like theirs, without honor, without significance.
And then they issue that really chilling challenge to the righteous man's faith.
Yes, that's a pivotal moment described in chapter 2, verses 13-20. The righteous man claims to know God, calls himself God's child. So the ungodly say, effectively, okay, let's test this claim. They propose to subject him to insult and torture, condemn him to a shameful death.
Why?
To see if his words hold up. For there shall be a visitation of him in accordance with his words. The underlying challenge is brutal. If this righteous man really is God's son, then God will surely uphold him and rescue him from this horrible fate. Let's see if God shows up.
It's a direct challenge not just to the man, but to God's justice and power. So what's the book's verdict on this kind of reasoning by the ungodly?
The sources, quoting from chapter 2, verses 21-24, are unequivocal. Their reasoning is dismissed as utter folly. Why? Because the ungodly were fundamentally led astray. Their own malice blinded them. Their wickedness literally prevented them from seeing the truth about God and reality.
They couldn't see straight because of their own bad choices.
That's the idea. They didn't understand God's hidden purposes, mysteries. They had no real hope for the reward that comes with holiness, and they failed to discern the ultimate prize waiting for blameless souls. Their own corrupted moral state completely obscured reality for them.
So their inner state literally blinded them. Okay, now let's flip the coin. Contrast that bleakness with the hope and reward presented for the righteous in the book.
It's a complete reversal.
Yeah.
Chapter 3, verses 1-9 paints a picture of absolute security and vindication. The souls of the righteous are described as being safely in the hands of God. No torment can truly touch them there.
Even if they suffer or die young.
Yes. Well, from the perspective of the foolish, the ungodly, they seem to die tragically or meaninglessly. The book insists their hope is full of immortality. Any suffering they endure in life is seen differently.
How so?
They might be chastened, tested, but it's done in mercy, like a loving father corrects a child, not in wrath. They are tested like gold refined in a furnace, like a sacrificial offering found worthy by God. And having passed the test, they will receive great good.
The imagery used is quite vivid.
It really is. They shall shine as lights. They will run to and fro like sparks among the stubble, suggesting energy, vibrancy, maybe judgment. And that promise of dominion is striking. They shall judge nations and have dominion over peoples.
So a complete reversal of their earthly status if they were oppressed?
Absolutely. Their trust and faithfulness lead them to understand truth and to abide forever in God's love. Grace and mercy are specifically for his chosen ones, his elect. And crucially, unlike the ungodly who expect nothing but oblivion, the righteous shall live forever. Their reward and their ongoing care are explicitly stated as being with the Most High. Chapter 5, verses 15-16.
They receive a glorious kingdom and a diadem of beauty, protected and covered by God himself.
Right. And the sources make an important clarification here. This passage focuses on the immortality of the soul, which goes to be with God immediately after death. There isn't really a doctrine of the resurrection of the body presented here in wisdom, unlike in some other Jewish or later Christian thought. It's about the soul's enduring life with God.
Okay, so the righteous are eternally secure, vindicated, and rewarded. A stark contrast indeed. What about the punishment of the ungodly? The book goes into more detail there too, right?
Oh, yes. It spells out their fate quite clearly.
Yeah.
As mentioned, they receive punishment according as they reasoned. 10:11. Their end mirrors their flawed, godless thinking. All their hopes, their labors, their works are declared ultimately vain, unfruitful, useless. Through 12:14.
And the negative consequences can even affect their families.
Yes, the book suggests that, mentioning that children born of unlawful unions might not reach maturity, or their very existence could serve as a witness against their parents' sinfulness later on.
And that comparison between the righteous person who dies young and the ungodly person who lives a long life gets revisited.
It does. The righteous person, even if they die young, is considered perfected and honored by God. 4:7-13. In fact, their short righteous life will ultimately condemn the old age of the unrighteous man full of years. The ungodly simply shall not understand God's purpose in taking the righteous early. They'll dismiss it as meaningless, but God, the book says, shall laugh them to scorn. 17-18.
And their final end is depicted pretty graphically.
Very much so. Their end is to be a dishonored carcass and a mockery among the dead forever. They face violent destruction, torment, and even their memory perishes. It's a picture of complete and utter ruin.
This really sets the stage for that powerful scene of judgment and remorse described later in the book.
Yes, chapter 5, verses 1-14 paints this incredibly dramatic picture of the final reversal. The righteous, who were perhaps oppressed and scorned in life, now stand boldly before their former tormentors.
And how do the wicked react?
They are utterly troubled with terrible fear. They are amazed at the unexpected deliverance and glorification of the righteous. It's the complete opposite of what they expected.
And they repent. Do they turn to God?
Not really, according to the sources. It's described more as bitter remorse, regret born out of fear and seeing they backed the wrong horse, rather than genuine religious repentance. They groan in anguish and lament. This is he whom we aforetime had in derision. A proverb of reproach, we fools. They ask, how is he then reckoned among the sons of God?
They're forced to admit they were totally wrong about everything.
Completely, they confess. We went astray from the path of truth, the light of righteousness shined not for us, and the way of the Lord we knew not. They have to acknowledge that all the things they valued, their pride, their riches, their boasting, were utterly useless in the end.
And the imagery used for how those things vanished.
It's very effective. Their life and accomplishments passed away like a shadow, like a rumor, like a ship leaving no trace in the water, a bird leaving no sign in the air, an arrow vanishing without a mark, like a stone skipping on water, or a guest who stays just one day and is gone. It directly counters their earlier philosophy of grabbing fleeting pleasures, because that's all there is. The book says, yes, those things were fleeting and ultimately worthless.
It's a really powerful literary technique, isn't it? Using this dramatic scene, this reversal of fortunes, to hammer home the book's core message. Ultimate justice prevails, the righteous are vindicated, the wicked do face condemnation, and the materialistic, pessimistic view is fundamentally wrong.
Absolutely. And thinking about why this might appeal to you, the listener, especially if you're seeking understanding about life's big questions, well, it offers a morally coherent vision of the universe. It says choices matter, justice wins out eventually, suffering for the faithful isn't the final word, and life has eternal significance. That can be a very compelling message.
It provides a strong moral and theological anchor. But the book isn't only about contrasting the righteous and the wicked. It circles back to explore the nature of wisdom herself in great depth, right? As the writer promises to do.
Exactly. After setting up that stark contrast and the framework of divine justice, the book dives back into its main subject, wisdom, and describes her in some truly remarkable, almost breathtaking terms.
And these descriptions really emphasize her divine origin, her incredibly close connection to God.
They absolutely do. For instance, the book says, wisdom sitteth by thee upon thy throne. She announced 4. I mean, picture that. It places her in this position of unparalleled closeness, almost sharing in God's authority and rule.
Right beside God.
And she was present with thee when thou madest the world. This reinforces that active role in creation we saw hinted at in Proverbs, making her almost a co-creator with God.
So not just a quality God possesses, but involved in the actual act of creation.
Seems so. And she's consistently presented as a direct gift from God. The writer, speaking as Solomon, understands he can't get her on his own. He explicitly prays for her to be sent down from God's holy heavens, from his glorious throne. Attaining wisdom requires divine grace.
The descriptions of her actual nature in Chapter 7 are incredibly rich. They use some pretty sophisticated, almost philosophical language, don't they?
They really do, especially in Chapter 7, verses 22b through 30. It's quite a list. She's described as a spirit. The sources note this might be a variant reading, but it points towards her non-material divine essence. She's called holy, single, manifold, subtle, mobile, pure, clear. These don't feel like just random poetic adjectives. They sound quite precise, almost like technical terms trying to capture her unique nature.
And the imagery used, a vapor of the power of God, a clear effluence of the glory of the Almighty.
Yes, that imagery is powerful. It suggests she emanates directly from God's own being, like light flowing from a source or steam rising from power, yet distinct. The sources highlight her absolute purity. Nothing defiled can even enter her. She's described as a reflection from the everlasting light, an unspotted mirror of the working of God, and significantly, an image of his goodness.
That language reflection, mirror, image, effluent sounds remarkably similar to language used much later in Christian theology to talk about the relationship between the Father and the Son, or divine attributes.
It really does. The sources point out the theological depth and the philosophical vocabulary being used here. These descriptions strongly suggest wisdom is being conceived of almost as a distinct divine hypostasis, a distinct aspect, manifestation, or personification of God, intimately linked to his nature and his action in the world. This wasn't necessarily standard Jewish teaching everywhere at the time. It really reflects that Alexandrian context, where Jewish thinkers were actively engaging with Greek philosophical concepts and language.
So what can this divine wisdom do? What are her capabilities?
The description continues. She can do all things. She renews all things. She passes into holy souls generation after generation. And this is profound. She makes people friends of God and prophets.
Wow. So she's not just cosmic, she's deeply personal. She enables that direct relationship with God, even inspiration to speak for him.
Exactly. A bridge between the divine and the human. She's also portrayed as superior to everything in the natural creation, even light itself. She's more beautiful than the sun, superior to every constellation of stars. Compared with physical light, she is found superior because, as the sources quote, evil shall not overcome wisdom. Whereas night follows day, wisdom is eternally triumphant over darkness and evil.
And she's everywhere.
Yes, she pervadeth and penetrateth all things by reason of her pureness, omnipresent, pure, invincible against evil, superior to all creation. It's an incredibly exalted picture of wisdom.
Truly is. Okay, so given this amazing nature, what are the practical benefits of actually attaining this divine wisdom? The book lists quite a few, doesn't it? Especially in chapter 8.
Oh, extensively. It's presented as the ultimate prize. What does she bring? Well, first, she reaches from end to end mightily and orders all well. This suggests she brings order not just to the cosmos, but to one's life. She provides structure and right arrangement.
Okay, order. What else?
She brings kinship with God, and God himself loveth those who live with her. She knows God's works intimately and is described as a companion in his works, a guide in his labors. Imagine having divine wisdom as your partner and guide in life.
That would certainly help.
Indeed. She's also a source of wealth and understanding. 5-6. This probably isn't just material wealth, but the true richness of deep knowledge, insight, and sound judgment. And crucially, she teaches the essential virtues: righteousness and prudence and justice and courage.
Righteousness, prudence, or wisdom, justice, courage. The sources point out those are the 4 cardinal virtues from Plato's philosophy.
Exactly. It's a clear example of the author integrating Greek philosophical concepts into his Jewish framework. Wisdom herself is the source of these core virtues. And righteousness here is understood in a dual sense: right relationship with God and right conduct towards other people.
So wisdom is the foundation for a complete ethical life, drawing on both traditions.
That's the picture painted. She also brings experience. She knows the past. She can discern or divine the future. She understands complex arguments and subtle speech. She can interpret dark sayings or riddles. She foresees signs and wonders and understands the outcomes of different seasons and times. She's an invaluable guide for navigating the complexities of the world and understanding deeper truths.
So Solomon, in the book, desires her as a counselor of what is good and a comfort in cares and grief.
Yes. It's not just abstract knowledge. It's practical guidance and emotional solace, too. And there are external benefits mentioned as well. She brings praise from others, honor among elders, sharp judgment that impresses rulers. Living with her, conversing with her, brings no bitterness. Life with her has no pain, but gladness and joy.
Which stands in such powerful contrast to the bitterness and torment awaiting the ungodly who chased fleeting pleasures.
Absolutely. And the ultimate benefits listed are profound. Immortality in kinship with wisdom, pure delight in her friendship, unceasing wealth in her labors, again likely spiritual wealth, understanding gained through communion with her, and great renown, 17-18. Remember that earlier point that the desire for wisdom leadeth unto a kingdom. Sex 20. This isn't necessarily a political kingdom, but a kind of moral and intellectual dominion, the authority that comes from possessing true insight.
Okay, the benefits are huge. So how does one actually get this amazing divine wisdom? What's the path?
The book uses Solomon's own purported experience as the model. 7:14-8, 19-9:11. What did Solomon do? First and foremost, he prayed for it, earnestly. He describes actively choosing her, consciously preferring her above all earthly goods, scepters, thrones, immense wealth, precious gems, even physical health. He loved her more than light itself.
So it requires a deliberate choice, a deep longing, and prioritizing her above everything else the world values.
Exactly. He describes learning wholeheartedly, being fully committed, and then wanting to share her gifts ungrudgingly with others. She's seen as an unfailing treasure, and those who use this treasure properly win the friendship of God.
There's that interesting bit about his soul, too. A good soul fell to my lot. Or even being good, I came into a body undefiled. What's that about?
The sources explain that this relates to the idea of the pre-existence of the soul, the notion that souls exist before being united with a body. This was an idea found in some later Jewish thought, but also significantly in Greek philosophies, like Platonism and Stoicism. It also connects to another idea that pops up in Wisdom, Threat 15, that the physical body can be a burden, or even a prison for the soul again, a concept familiar from Greek and Alexandrian thought. It really shows the blend of ideas happening in this book.
But even with this supposedly good soul, Solomon still recognized he couldn't attain wisdom on his own.
Absolutely crucial point. He knew he couldn't obtain her unless God gave her.
This reinforces the central theme. Wisdom, in this profound sense, is ultimately a divine gift. It must be sought through earnest desire, through prioritizing her, and through humble prayer, recognizing our dependence on God.
So it's not just about intellectual effort. No. As the sources quote from chapter 6, 6-12-16, she is actually easily found by those who genuinely seek her. You just need to rise early for her, be diligent. The true beginning of her is the desire for instruction. That desire leads to love for her, which leads to observing God's laws, which leads to incorruption or immortality, which brings you near to God. It's a whole path.
So, framed for you, the listener, pursuing this kind of deep understanding and insight in your own life, it seems to involve conscious choices, prioritizing what truly matters, actively seeking, maybe through study and reflection, but also recognizing that the deepest insights might ultimately be gifts, perhaps requiring a posture of humility or openness.
It definitely shifts the idea of learning. It's not just about passively accumulating facts, but about an active, engaged pursuit that transforms your whole orientation towards truth and, in this context, towards the divine.
Absolutely. Okay, now, the book takes a significant turn in the second half. The largest section, roughly chapters 10 through 19, shifts focus dramatically to recount Israelite history. But it's not presented as just a dry history lesson, is it?
Not at all. It's history told through a very specific theological lens. It uses stories from Israel's past, especially the Exodus, to illustrate the principles laid out earlier. God's justice, his providence, the stark difference in outcomes for the righteous, Israel, and the ungodly, primarily their enemies, especially the Egyptians, and the activity of wisdom throughout.
So history becomes a case study for the book's theology. Chapter 10 starts with wisdom's actions among the early heroes.
Yes, it's like wisdom's highlight reel from Genesis.
Yeah.
It begins with Adam Jesus. Wisdom protected him, delivered him from his transgression. She saved Noah from the flood, and interestingly, the sources point out that the book here attributes the cause of the flood specifically to Cain's wickedness, a detail not in Genesis.
Adding interpretative layers or maybe drawing on other traditions.
Seems likely. The sources call these picturesque exaggerations and possibly influences from Jewish legends. Wisdom also delivered Lot from the fire that destroyed Sodom, and the book mentions specific tangible witnesses still existing that point to Sodom's wickedness. The smoking wasteland, plants bearing fruitless fruit, and Lot's wife, famously turned into a pillar of salt, described here as a memorial of an unbelieving soul.
Wow, very specific detail.
Yes. Those who've ignored wisdom, like the people of Sodom, left behind only a memorial of their folly. Wisdom also delivered others who waited on her. The text is a bit vague, but possibly referring to Abraham fleeing his brother's wrath, or Jacob escaping from Esau. She guided Jacob, stood by him against oppressors like his father-in-law Laban, made him rich, guarded him from enemies, judged in his conflicts, demonstrating that godliness is more powerful than aught else.
And she doesn't abandon Joseph even when he's sold into slavery.
No, the book says she deserted not Joseph when sold, delivered him from sin, presumably Potiphar's wife, went down into the dungeon with him, and ultimately was the means by which he rose to power, bringing him to a kingdom and glory.
And Moses.
She opened the mouth of the dumb and made the tongues of babes eloquent, almost certainly a reference to Moses, who initially protested he wasn't a good speaker. She led the people out of Egypt, guided them through the Red Sea, and here wisdom herself is explicitly identified with the luminous cloud, the pillar of cloud and fire that guided and protected them.
So the book uses these iconic figures to show wisdom wasn't just an abstract concept, but an active force intervening on behalf of the righteous throughout history.
Exactly. And this historical narrative consistently, relentlessly contrasts Israel's experience with that of their enemies, especially the Egyptians. It does this often to illustrate that key principle we mentioned earlier, retributive justice.
That idea that people are punished by the very things they sinned with?
Precisely. That principle, by what things a man sinneth, by these he is punished, 11:16, is stated explicitly and illustrated repeatedly. For example, the book contrasts Israel receiving abundant, life-giving water from a rock in the dry desert, with the Egyptians having their life source, the Nile, turned into undrinkable blood.
The water that blessed one punished the other?
Right. Or remember how the Egyptians worshipped various animals, including senseless reptiles and vermin? Well, they were punished by being plagued by swarms of senseless animals, 11:16-19, 18-19. The punishment fits the crime. using the instrument of their sin against them.
It's a very direct form of poetic justice.
It is. The book contrasts how Israel was tested or tried in mercy, like experiencing thirst in the desert, which was temporary and led to miraculous provision while the Egyptians were tormented in wrath. Israel was admonished as a father, gently corrected, while the Egyptians were condemned as a stern king, facing harsh judgment. The Egyptians even suffered double grief, their own suffering, and seeing Israel prosper while they suffered.
And the contrast regarding food during the wilderness journey and plagues is another key example.
Yes, very stark. And Israel was miraculously fed with angels' food, the manna, which appeared without labor and tasted like whatever each person desired, having all sweetness. 2021. The Egyptians, meanwhile, when desiring food, were afflicted by hideous swarms of vermin that made eating impossible or disgusting.
So one group gets miraculous provision, the other gets plagued by disgusting creatures related to their sin of idolatry.
Exactly. And the manna wasn't just physical sustenance. It taught Israel a crucial theological lesson, as the sources quote. It is not the growth of the crops that nourisheth men, but thy word which preserveth them that believe in thee. Sustenance comes ultimately from God's command, not just natural processes.
That's a deep theological interpretation woven right into the narrative about bread from heaven.
It is. Another powerful contrast is light versus darkness. The Egyptians were afflicted by that thick, palpable, terrifying darkness. They were tormented by irrational fears, saw spectral forms, heard strange noises. Their own magic arts completely failed them. Even normal night sounds terrified them because they were trapped in this unnatural gloom. The book calls this darkness an image of the darkness that was to receive them later in Hades 21.
A foretaste of their ultimate doom. And for Israel during this time.
For Israel, simultaneously, there was a very great light. While the Egyptians were plunged into darkness, Israel had the burning pillar of fire and a harmless sun to guide their journey. The Egyptians, hearing the Israelites' voices but unable to see them, actually started to account them happy and even tried to gain favor from them.
And the book connects Egypt's punishment of darkness directly to their sin.
Yes. The sources point out that the darkness is framed as fitting punishment for having kept God's sons, the Israelites, closely shut up in captivity, the very people through whom the incorruptible light of the law was to be given to the world. They tried to extinguish the light bearers, so they were punished with darkness.
The punishment fits the crime again, and the death of the Egyptian firstborn, also seen as retribution.
Explicitly so. The sources explain that the death of the firstborn is presented as direct payback for the Egyptians' earlier attempt to kill the Israelite male infants, with specific reference to Moses' own exposure as a baby. And finally, of course, their pursuit ends with the destruction of their army in the Red Sea flood.
So the plagues in the Exodus are interpreted entirely as God's judgments, where even the natural elements rearrange themselves to serve God's purpose.
Exactly. The book emphasizes how creation itself fought against God's enemies and worked for his people. You have land creatures surviving in water, water creatures coming onto land, fire burning strangely within water, in the hail, water quenching fire when it should have fueled it, hail falling alongside fire, even ashes somehow retaining their coldness instead of burning. The message is clear. The entire created order ministers to God's will to save his people and judge their enemies. And there's that interesting comparison made between the Egyptians and the men of Sodom, suggesting the Egyptian sin was somehow worse. Yes, that's in chapter 19, 13 to 15. The argument is that the men of Sodom merely refused hospitality to unknown strangers, Lot's angelic visitors. The Egyptians, however, had initially welcomed the Israelites, who had lived among them and already shared the same rights, living in the land of Goshen, and then they turned on them and vexed them with harsh slave labor. Their sin was seen as a betrayal of an existing relationship, hence deserving of a punishment of another sort.
They violated hospitality and covenant, in a sense. The book also mentions the plague of blindness striking the Egyptians.
Yes, likening it explicitly to the incident at Lot's door in Sodom, where the men trying to break in to harm righteous Lot were struck with blindness. Again, the punishment mirrors the sin or the situation.
So this whole historical section really hammers home the theme of God's active, judging presence in history, working things out according to principles of retributive justice.
It strongly emphasizes that, yes, God is not passive. He intervenes to uphold the righteous and punish wickedness, often in ways that directly reflect the nature of the sin itself.
But importantly, the book doesn't just portray God as wrathful and judgmental. It balances this with depictions of divine compassion and long-suffering, right?
It does, and that's crucial. To avoid presenting God as purely punitive, the book includes strong affirmations of his love and mercy. For instance, it says, God spares all things, for they are thine, O sovereign Lord, that lovest souls. His incorruptible spirit is in all things, suggesting a universal presence and sustaining power, not just focused on judgment.
And how does this compassion play out when people err or sin? Does he just strike them down?
No, the book suggests a process. God convinces the erring little by little. He admonishes them by means of the things wherein they sin, using their own mistakes as teaching moments, precisely so they can escape wickedness and come to believe in him.
Mm-hmm.
The sources note a connection here to Romans chapter 2, verse 4, which talks about the goodness of God being intended to lead people to repentance.
So even the consequences of sin can be a form of corrective mercy, giving people a chance to turn back.
That's the idea presented. A prime example is God's long-suffering towards the Canaanites, detailed in chapter 12, verse 3:11. The book acknowledges their practices were detestable child sacrifice, ritual cannibalism, and even calls them an inherently evil nation, a seed accursed from the beginning. Yet despite this, God didn't wipe them out instantly. He sent judgment little by little, explicitly granting them a place of repentance.
Even for people described as inherently evil.
Yes. The book uses this to show that God didn't punish them immediately out of weakness or fear, but out of a desire, however slim the chance, for them to change. The sources do note that this line of reasoning, emphasizing God wasn't afraid, might seem like an immature conception of God to modern ears, perhaps reflecting an earlier stage of theological reflection.
But the point is his patience, his willingness to give time for change.
Exactly. The book insists God is righteous and therefore rules righteously. He doesn't condemn anyone unjustly. His almighty power is the very origin of his righteousness, and because he is Lord of all, this makes him spare all. 12:16. He judges with gentleness and governs with much forbearance, specifically giving people times and place for repentance. 18-20.
And this divine pattern of judgment mixed with mercy isn't just about understanding God's dealings with enemies. It's meant as a lesson for Israel, too.
Absolutely. The book states explicitly that Israel, seeing themselves chastened by God while their enemies are scourged 10,000-fold, should teach them something important. What's the lesson? They should take careful thought of thy goodness when we judge others, and conversely, when we ourselves are judged, we may look for mercy.
That has direct relevance for you, the listener, doesn't it? How does reflecting on God's balance of justice and mercy as presented here inform how you approach judging others or how you think about seeking mercy for yourself?
It provides a theological framework for self-examination, modeled on the divine character described in the book. So yes, this whole historical narrative ultimately serves to illustrate and reinforce the book's main themes about wisdom, justice, divine providence, and the importance of righteous living, grounding them in specific, albeit theologically interpreted, historical events.
Okay, moving on to another major theme that runs through the book, especially in chapters 13 through 15, a really comprehensive and, frankly, scathing critique of idolatry. The sources detail how the book explores its origins and its devastating consequences.
Yes, this critique is absolutely central, especially when you remember the likely setting, a Hellenistic city like Alexandria, just teeming with various forms of pagan worship, emperor cults, mystery religions, you name it. The author is mounting a powerful argument against all of it, trying to expose what he sees as its utter irrationality and profound moral danger.
Where does the critique begin? What's the first step down the wrong path?
It starts with what the book considers the least blameworthy error, the mistaken worship of nature itself. The book calls people who do this vain and ignorant of God. They look at the beauty and power of the created world, fire, wind, stars, water, the sun and moon, and they fail to look beyond these things to the one who made them. They mistake the creation for the creator.
But the book shows a little bit of sympathy for them initially.
Sort of, yes. The sources point out that the book says there's only small blame attached to these particular people. Why? Because in a sense, they were genuinely seeking God. They were making a diligent search, and they were understandably impressed, even persuaded, by the sheer beauty and power of the things they could see. They saw the magnificent artwork and mistook it for the artist.
But that initial sympathy doesn't excuse them in the end.
No. Nevertheless, the sources, quote, they are not to be pardoned. The argument is basically this. If they had enough intelligence to study the world, conjecture about the world, and appreciate its greatness and beauty, then they should have had enough intelligence to reason one step further and find its master, the author of beauty, the first maker. It implies a culpable failure of reason they didn't follow their own logic through to its necessary conclusion.
Okay, so that's the error of worshiping nature. But the critique gets much harsher when it talks about worshiping things made by human hands, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. That's detailed in chapter 13, 10 to 19, and again in chapter 15, verses 7 to 17. The book pulls no punches here. It declares that miserable are those whose hopes are foolishly pinned on dead things. Idols made by human artisans out of gold, silver, stone, or wood. Lifeless objects.
And the imagery used to describe how these idols are made is deliberately designed to show how absurd the whole process is.
It is, and it often echoes satirical passages from earlier prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, who also mocked idol-making. Wisdom describes a carpenter taking a leftover piece of wood, maybe a crooked, knotty bit that's useless for anything else after using the better parts for furniture or fuel. He carves this useless scrap into a crude human form.
Right.
Then he paints it, maybe mounts it on a wall, sets it up to guard his property.
Right.
And then, the ultimate absurdity, he prays to this lifeless block of wood for everything he needs. Wealth, marriage, children, health, safe journeys. He asks a dead thing for life and prosperity. It's portrayed as utterly irrational.
Asking the lifeless for life.
Yeah, that captures the core critique. And the potter metaphor gets used again to make a similar point. XV 7:17. The potter takes clay and skillfully molds useful vessels, like pots and bowls. But then, from the exact same lump of clay, he also fashions a vain god, an idol. The absurdity is highlighted. The maker himself is mortal, made of earth, destined to return to earth. His very soul, his life, is just lent to him by the true God. Yet this finite temporary being presumes to compete with skilled artisans in gold or silver and takes pride in molding these counterfeit gods.
The language describing the idol maker himself is pretty harsh.
Very much so. Phrases like, his heart is ashes and his hope of less value than earth and his life of less honor than clay. He's fundamentally ignorant of his own creator, the one who breathed life into him. He knows he's making brittle, breakable things out of dirt. He knows it's wrong. He sinneth. Yet he does it anyway, driven by greed and the desire for profit.
And the book considers the Egyptians particularly foolish in this regard.
Yes, calling them the most foolish of all, those enemies who oppressed Israel. Why? Because they regarded all the idols of the Gentiles as God's idols, which, the book emphasizes, lack even basic senses. They have eyes that can't see, nostrils that can't smell, ears that can't hear, hands that can't feel, feet that can't walk. The book even argues that the animals worshipped by the Egyptians, which was also condemned, were better than man-made idols because at least the animals were alive and had senses.
So the critique hits on multiple levels. It's theologically wrong, it's fundamentally illogical, and it's demeaning for humans to worship something inferior to themselves, let alone lifeless matter.
Exactly. But the book doesn't stop at calling idolatry a mistake or foolishness. It goes on to propose specific, more culpable origins for the practice, suggesting it didn't just arise from innocent error. Chapter 14, 11 to 21, digs into this.
It says, idols weren't there from the beginning. They entered the world through empty imagining.
Yes, through human vanity and delusion, not from any divine reality. And the book predicts a speedy end was devised for them. They are temporary and destined to perish. So what are these negative origins? The first one proposed is grief, 4 times 15.
Grief. How does grief lead to idolatry?
The scenario described is a father, devastated by the untimely death of his child. In his overwhelming grief, he makes an image of the dead child. He starts honoring this image, perhaps treating it as if the child were still present, eventually honoring it as a god. Then he establishes secret mysteries and rites associated with this image for his household or dependents to follow. The sources note this sounds very much like the theories of Euhemerus, who argued gods were originally deified humans, or practices related to ancestor worship.
Okay, so grief leading to the deification of the dead. What's the second origin?
Rulers' commands, 14:16. The idea here is that the ungodly custom of worshiping images, one started perhaps for other reasons, grew strong over time and was eventually enforced as law by powerful rulers. People were compelled to worship idols by political authority.
And the third origin involves human ambition and flattery.
Exactly. Artificers' ambition and flattery, 14:17 to 20. This scenario imagines people living far away from a powerful ruler they wish to honor. Since they can't honor him in person, they commission an image of him. The artisan, perhaps wanting to gain favor with the ruler or simply driven by artistic pride, makes the image more beautiful or impressive than the actual person. The common people, the multitude, are then captivated by the sheer grace and skill of the artwork, and they end up worshiping this enhanced image of the man who was formerly just a ruler.
The sources mention the historical context here, too.
Yes, the deification of Hellenistic rulers like Alexander the Great, The Ptolemies in Egypt and later Roman emperors like Caligula fits this pattern perfectly. It was a known phenomenon.
So idolatry is presented as stemming from unhealthy grief, political coercion, or human vanity and artistic deception, none of them noble or based on truth.
Precisely. And this whole practice became a terrible snare for humanity. The sources quote the book saying that people, caught in bondage either to calamity or tyranny, ended up giving God's own incommunicable name, the sacred name YHWH, meant only for the one true God, to mere stones and stocks. They attributed divine power and even the unique divine name to lifeless objects.
And the consequences of this fundamental error, this idolatry, are shown to be devastating, extending far beyond just bad theology into complete moral collapse.
This is a major thrust of the argument, powerfully laid out in chapter 14, verses 22-31. The book makes a direct causal link. Ignorance of the true God, which stems from or is embodied in idolatry, inevitably leads to a cascade of great evils. And shockingly, the idolaters are depicted as calling this state of moral chaos peace.
The list of vices that follow is pretty comprehensive and disturbing. It paints a picture of total societal breakdown.
It really does. The list includes ritual child sacrifice, slaughtering children in solemn rites, secret, perhaps orgiastic, mysteries, frantic revels with strange rules, generally impure lives and chaotic marriages, plotting against others, ambush, murder, adultery, theft, fraud, corruption, breaking faith, social unrest, tumult, perjury, confusing good and evil, ingratitude, forgetting favor, spiritual defilement, defiling souls, sexual confusion, changing of sex, disorder in marriage, adultery again, and general debauchery. It's a catalog of moral disintegration.
It sounds like almost every kind of sin and social ill is traced back to this root problem of worshiping false gods.
That is exactly the argument the book makes. The sources quote that stark summary conclusion. For the worship of those nameless idols is the beginning and cause and end of every evil. It's the source, the motivation, and the ultimate outcome. Those involved descend into madness, prophesy lies, live unrighteously, break oaths easily, all because they foolishly trust lifeless idols to protect them from the consequences.
But divine justice isn't fooled by lifeless idols.
Not at all. The book insists that a just doom still pursues them, for two main reasons. First, for their fundamentally wrong thinking about God, thinking evilly of God, by paying attention to idols, and second, for their contempt for holiness shown by swearing false oaths deceitfully. It's justice itself, the principle of divine order, not the power or lack thereof of the idols they swore by, that ultimately catches up with their transgressions.
And as a final point in this section, Israel's faithfulness, or at least the ideal of it, is presented as the stark contrast to all this idolatry and its resulting corruption.
Yes, briefly in chapter 15, verses 1-6, the book pivots back to Israel's perspective, addressing God. But thou, our God, art loving and true, long-suffering and in mercy, ordering all things. The key difference is knowledge and relationship. Israel, ideally, knows God's strength, knows they are counted as his people, and the book makes this profound statement. For to know thee is perfect righteousness, and to know thy power is the root of immortality.
Knowledge of God equals righteousness and the source of immortality.
Exactly. Because they know the true God, they were not, or should not have been, led astray by the foolishness of making or worshiping idols. Their knowledge of the true God is their protection and the foundation of their hope.
So, when you put it all together, this book, likely coming out of that vibrant, complex, sometimes conflicting environment of Hellenistic Alexandria, is doing something really interesting. It's weaving together traditional Jewish history and law with concepts and language borrowed from Greek philosophy, things like the nature of the soul, the cardinal virtues, the philosophical descriptions of wisdom, to build this powerful, comprehensive case.
A case for sticking with monotheism, for living righteously according to God's law as embodied by wisdom, and for rejecting the allure of paganism and maybe even philosophical systems like Epicureanism that seem to undermine traditional faith, morality, and hope in the afterlife. It's this unique blend, this synthesis of traditions, that makes the Book of Wisdom such a fascinating and rich source for understanding the intellectual and religious dynamics of that particular historical period.
It's clearly a complex text, deeply engaged with the big ideas and challenges of its time.
Without a doubt.
And that, I think, brings us toward the end of our deep dive into these detailed excerpts from The Wisdom of Solomon.
We've certainly covered a lot of ground today. We look at that evolving concept of wisdom, chokma, from practical skill to this near-divine personification. We explore the book's debated origins, its likely context in Alexandria, its fascinating relationship with Ecclesiastes, and its potential influence on St. Paul.
Yeah, and we delved into its core themes. That dramatic contrast between the fates of the righteous and the ungodly, the detailed recounting of history to illustrate God's justice and providence, and that thorough, multi-pronged critique of the folly and danger of idolatry.
This material really gives us a powerful summary of the book's central arguments. It shows us an ancient writer wrestling with truly fundamental human questions. What is real wisdom and where do we find it? How does God actually interact with the world? Is there ultimate justice? What happens after death? What are the real dangers of worshiping false gods or false ideas?
And understanding these questions and seeing how this particular book offered its unique answers, blending Jewish tradition with the language and concepts of Hellenistic thought, it gives you, the listener, a really valuable perspective. It helps trace the development of religious ideas and eliminates that enduring human quest for meaning, for justice, for connection with something ultimate.
It's a snapshot of a crucial moment in intellectual history.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, maybe hold on to that image of wisdom's journey from earthly skill to divine guide. And remember that stark choice the book presents, a life chasing fleeting, ultimately empty pleasures versus a life lived in kinship with divine wisdom, leading to lasting value and even immortality.
And perhaps consider this final provocative thought stemming directly from the text. The book states that to know thee, God, is perfect righteousness, and to know thy power is the root of immortality. Conversely, the ungodly, blinded by malice, knew not the mysteries of God. If knowledge of God is so central to righteousness and eternal well-being, how does your own pursuit of knowledge and understanding today connect or fail to connect with what this ancient writer considered the deepest, most fundamental truths about life, justice, and our ultimate destiny?
That's definitely something to ponder. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time.